very lucky and privileged to have Mark Prager, the Senior Director of Talent and Development at LinkedIn, be our moderator. Quickly going through introductions down the line, we also are grateful to have Brandy Nicole Johnson with us, who's the Global Director of Learning and Development at DoorDash. Next, we also have Emily Ricci, who's the former Director of Learning, Leadership, and Org Effectiveness at Robinhood. And then lastly, we also have Lane Greer, who is the Director of People Development at Google. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Mark to kick everything off.
Thank you, Shannon. Hope everybody's good after lunch and not too tired, because I'm hoping this is going to be a high-energy presentation today. Who doesn't think about managers all the time? If you're in the learning profession, I think I'm borderline obsessed with people leaders. And I'll give you, at LinkedIn, I think probably 3/4 of our budget, L&D budget, goes to people leaders. Could be leadership development, manager development. And you may have similar, outlays of resources and time where you work, but they're just so critical. And we hear over and over again, managers have never been more important, yet they've never been more stressed and sometimes ill-equipped to deal with all the expectations. I read one stat the other day. It was on the LinkedIn feed, which caught my attention, and it's from Gallup, like the Gallup poll people. I guess they're now in the management measurement space. But they said that they found their most profound finding ever. When somebody says most profound, kind of, look twice at it. 70% of the variance in team engagement is determined solely by the manager. Yep. When managers are burned out and disengaged, company-wide performance suffers. Look at that. You saw the same one. There's lots of powerful statistics out there about managers and the role they play. So let's kick it off. Turn to the panel. The last 3 years have been quite a roller coaster for all of us in this room, and especially for frontline people leaders. Starting with you, Brandy Nicole, how do you see the role of the manager changing, or how has it changed in the past 3 years?
Well, let's get real. It's harder than it ever has been. I can think back to a time where pre-pandemic, work ended, and it really ended at 5 or at 6. And now, with what's happened over the last 3 years, it seems like, and I'm going to just speak from my experience, so I'll use I language here, but let me know if this resonates with you at all. I feel like there are some days where I'm on an emotional roller coaster because I'm in a meeting giving someone feedback about how awesome they were, but then I go to an executive stakeholder meeting and they're not aligned with how we want to move forward. And so the impact and the emotions of what that's like to carry day after day, back to back with no breaks in between, it's been really hard. I'll own that as a leader, I'm tired, but I've also never been more optimistic about our opportunities as leaders of our orgs and our functions to help our orgs really think about how we can invest in manager development. So over the last 2 years that I've been at DoorDash, we've had a lot of success there. I also recognize now more than ever, managers need friends. If we're honest, leadership can be pretty isolating and sometimes it can be lonely. And so with that in mind, one of the things that I found to be really helpful is to help managers create the space for community, whether that's at company or at work, or maybe it's outside of that. I think we all need a care team. I don't know about y'all, but I talk to my therapist. I also make sure I've blocked time for Shondaland on Thursday nights because everybody needs a break. And then I think about other things that restore me and bring me joy. I think now that statistic from Gallup, knowing that managers have such a significant impact day over day on employee experience, we really have to recognize when it's time to let go. And if we're in a season where we no longer feel called to management, we need to know that it's okay to step away too.
So
can I just get us to spare a thought for these poor managers who have suffered through, so much change, and we among them, over the last 3 years. They're getting squeezed from every possible direction. The context has changed. The conditions have changed. It's really, really tough to lead people right now, and you all know that, but so do they. And imagine, too, that during this time, you're a very first-time leader, or you were promoted newly, or you're an emerging leader. I mean, this is exceptionally challenging. And so I think it's challenging on two fronts. So one is the what, and the other is the how. And you mentioned some of these, but the what really being that alongside the environment that has, just taken VUCA to a whole new level, we have the pace of work and the rate of expected innovation is accelerating so rapidly and now being pushed down to people who, may not have otherwise been, responsible or had innovation on their agenda, and now they suddenly do, right, amidst everything else. So that's really, really hard. And also, increasingly, managers are now being asked to set the tone for the team. And they have to do this being hamstrung by their environment. So they're working with tools that are not very great, such as, being on a video conference all day long, right? And missing out on a lot of the contextual cues and other things that they would normally get, being in a regular environment. And so those two things together make it super, super tough to manage. And so the organizations that are getting ahead and that are starting to kind of claw their way out of this are ones who have made space for managers to learn how to create psychological safety on their teams. They have taught them how to have effective one-on-ones and build trust and do these kinds of human-centric activities that then plant the seeds for creating innovation and help them win, even though the environment is so tough.
Everything they've said. I mean, what's left? No, I would say the last 3 years, I think, have revealed the gaps we have in manager capability, right? I think in many organizations, that has been a transactional function sometimes. And as we all know, what was required of leaders over the last 3 years was not transactions, but was deep human empathy, caring, helping individuals navigate a world that none of us expected to be navigating. And so for me personally, what I get really excited to think about is I think we have an opportunity, I think we have a calling to dramatically reimagine the role of managers in organizations and move away from that transactional nature into people who truly see this as a vocation. They see growing, developing, being a human leader as part of what the legacy is they want to leave in the world. And I couldn't agree more with, if you don't feel that calling, please get out of the way. There's too much important, really human-centered work to be done in this space.
Great. So there's a notion that companies don't really need managers, they need coaches. What's your take on coaching, and how have you put it into practice?
I am a coach. I love coaching, and the reality is, I also love coaching because it's unregulated, but that's a whole nother conversation as an industry. The reality is, companies are still going to need individuals to hold everyone accountable, and that's the role that I believe managers play. That's one of the roles. I also really strongly believe in managers as coaches. So again, one of the things that's worked really well over the last 2 years at DoorDash is we've taken managers through an experience that's allowed us to train them in that way. And so now they're using their coaching skills and conversations, and we're seeing it show up context of retention. So if we train managers to be coaches, to ask thoughtful questions, to get and to stay curious, to not give all the answers to their employees, I think we'll start to see not only managers enjoy their work more, but also employees take more ownership over their results. Yeah.
Trying to disaggregate these two things, it kind of reminds me of that saying, courage is knowing something will hurt and doing it anyway, and stupidity is the same, and that's why life is hard. So I think it's sort of like you need both, and that's why leadership is hard, right? You cannot split these two, in my informed opinion. And I think that, organizations are starting finally to get wise to this, and there's tons and tons of data that backs this up, that coaching is an essential skill, and that it is fundamental to leadership. But if you've ever worked for somebody who is only a visionary and only really good at building trust and doing team building, your life is pretty bad, right? And conversely, if you've only ever worked for that super IC who ascended the ranks and they're a great technician and and they don't have any people skills whatsoever, your life is likewise really bad. So I think what we're finding is that you have to have an integration of both of those things, and I'm really excited that we're at the point where it's being recognized.
Once again, I'd have to agree with my peers here. I mean, I think it's a false binary as well. I don't think it's an either or, which is similar to what we're saying. I would also say the pressure put on managers to be equally skilled in both of those spaces makes me really think about what's the broader ecosystem that any team member needs to support their development and growth. Sometimes you have a manager who's an awesome coach, sometimes you have a great visionary, and sometimes you don't click with that person at all. And so for me, I keep thinking about what's this bigger ecosystem, and particularly in the coaching space, how do we leverage coaches across the organization so that it's not so manager dependent on whether or not you're getting the support and development you need, but we're taking it outside of just that one-to-one relationship and expanding that across a network of people who are here to support each other in their growth.
I think there's an important distinction to just to dovetail between coaching and mentoring, and that we heard a little bit about this in an earlier panel about how, especially with our DEIB initiatives, that deliberate mentorship and creating those spaces for mentorship and reverse mentorship are highly critical. But there's a difference, and that, coaching is more you focused. And it's about feelings, values, and facts. So it's really knowing how to ask the right questions, and that can be taught to managers. You can teach people how to ask the right questions and get to the right insights and help their teammates have self-generated insights. Mentoring, which I think often comes more from the technicians, although not always, is a lot about stories, experience, wisdom. It's more I statements. So I know how to do this. If I were you, I would do this. I've been in this position before. Here's what I would do. And so I think, as an organization, you have to also kind of know where you fall and what makes sense for your people, and knowing that I think it takes a while to sort of build up to the ranks of mentorship, and coaching is something that's immediately graspable.
Great. Let's talk about retention. So for a long time, managers have been on the front line of retention, and there's that old line about employees don't leave companies, they leave managers. And I think we kind of saw that blow up during the pandemic. Employees left companies for all sorts of reasons, having nothing to do with their managers, let's say. Certainly not in those numbers. But then there were other things at the companies, inequities. I think some of this was touched on in the panel before lunch, but all sorts of reasons for people to say, yeah, I don't want any more of this. But still, managers are critical. I have another statistic for you. 70% of employees with managers who have low emotional intelligence report negative feelings towards work. So if your manager has low EI, most of you are going to have negative feelings towards work. And lack of perceived care for wellness for managers leads to much higher turnover, right? Especially recently. So my question for the panel, and I'll start with Lane this time. What levers can L&D pull to support employee retention through managers?
All right. Well, a couple of thoughts with this particular question, and I think about this question of well-being, and I think it certainly sits outside of L&D. What I've been really gratified to see is more and more senior leaders taking responsibility for creating a sustainable organization, including people's ability to have work-life balance, mental well-being or mental health. And so I think L&D is certainly a supporter in that mechanism, but that has to be owned at the top. And I think often it has fallen on L&D's shoulders, or in other organizations into the benefits team responsibility of like, oh, you're going to fix well-being for our employees. And absolutely not, right? So I think we have a key role as a strategic business partner to make sure that those types of goals and sentiment are both measured, tracked, and we're watching progress of it and saying, here's what we can do. Here's how we can help leaders have real open and honest conversations about what well-being looks like. When someone's not feeling supported, how do we start to move things off of their plate to give them that space? But I think we have a huge and long way to go, particularly coming out of the last 3 years. And then I think about, as Emily referenced, like these managers who also are suffering from that same sort of burnout and lack of feeling supported to take the time they need to be in a good place. And therefore, that's absolutely impacting their teams.
Let's mix this up. Now you go.
I'm trying to think of what would be most helpful here of what I've seen and tactical things that I think we can scale and cascade across L&D. One, adopting a no meeting day. Like, are we training our managers to really encourage their teams to block out the time so that they can do that deep work and focus? Two, one of the other things that I saw work really well last year for my org is we intentionally slowed down the last 2 weeks of the year, so I asked my team to take the last 2 weeks off, and I was their proxy. So when finance needed something for those end-of-year reports, I got the slacks. They didn't. We also looked at thinking about recharge and what that might mean for them. So if you have a diverse team, especially if you have someone that identifies as the first and the only in your organization, it's really important to get curious about what well-being and what work-life integration might mean to them, because it might be different than what you've previously experienced. And so the more I got curious, the more I realized that for my team, having a consecutive day where they could reinvest in themselves in a way that was meaningful to them was really helpful. The last thing that's been really helpful is just being really clear about the why up front. With today and how the world of work works, and the fact that when you think about it, we spend a third of our lives working if we decide to work. That's a lot of time. So how can we really help and support those when they're making choices about their career, their journey, and their lives overall, knowing that I think the last 3 years have really taught us we cannot separate.
So great suggestions on some system impacts that we can try to create. And when I was at Apple, just a quick story, I'm not supposed to talk about this, but you know, what are they gonna do? So we spun up this whole course on, it was called Conquering Burnout, which I think the title was a little problematic, first of all. But to Lane's earlier point, it was all incumbent on L&D to sort of deliver this, tips on how do you combat burnout. And most of the people were in the throes of experiencing COVID and, grappling with all kinds of unprecedented circumstances that we all have discussed at length. And to both of your points, although the content was great, well-researched, spot on, people liked it, because we all want them to like it. The main critique was, well, but the system is not rising up to meet us. So what are we going to do about it? If my manager, if my leader of leaders is not helping me out, then it really doesn't matter. And so similarly, it's a pretty short bridge to attrition and disengagement when your manager does not have the right emotional intelligence and the right understanding of what well-being really is. So the system has to help them. And then we also need to help enable them to the point where L&D can help influence retention. We need to teach them really basic skills in our manager and leader development around how do you have a conversation with somebody, to your earlier point, about what their unique circumstances are and tailor your work and your environment to what they're experiencing, even if it is different from everybody else, because that is the point, right? And so I think it's a little bit of us and a whole lot of them. And to Tracy's earlier point this morning, we also have to be in the right room with the right people, having the right conversations about what retention really looks like in our organizations, what we really care about, and then how we're going to sort of ladder up to what those outcomes are in our L&D agenda.
I wonder, the manager has limited time. I wonder, when is enough enough? So we've put retention on them, and retention is very tricky, hard to get in front of. Yet companies look at it very seriously. It's one thing if somebody moves internally, that's a win, right? Oh, they didn't leave the company, they wanted to do something different. That could be celebrated. If they leave the company, it's a very bad reflection on the manager. It just is, at least where I come from. But there's another aspect, which is career. So it's not just about keeping people at all costs, but what about career? Now you're supposed to be the career champion. You're supposed to develop your employees and look out for the next thing for them. Also very complicated, and also not easy to sit down with an employee and have a career conversation, because that is blue sky. And a lot of managers are nervous. It's like, so what do you want to do? What are your goals? I want to leave, I want your job. It's scary. So I'm wondering, how do you balance all those things, Not only do they have to, control the employees, get results, drive performance, but they have retention and career. What do you do?
Okay, a nice easy one. Can you repeat the last part of your question?
How much is too much?
How much is too much? So I think, you're speaking to the fear that a lot of leaders very understandably face in having these types of conversations, if we're specifically talking about trying to, stave off attrition. But I like to take the attitude of holding talent with an open hand. And that comes from a place of, courageousness, and also, it's not my first rodeo. So, but what we need to do is we need to impart that to other leaders to give them the same confidence. And that's a systems effect, right? That we give them the confidence, and that the system supports them being able to have some latitude in where they can possibly grow and take their career, so that you can have a conversation with them without having the scarcity mindset. Right? So the system has to do its part, but then we as leaders, and the leaders that we also lead and educate, in our case as L&D practitioners, we need to help them have the conversations, understand the realm of the possible in their organizations, and also be able to just engage in a way that I think is different than what a lot of us have experienced personally. Over to you, Lane.
I think, gosh, I've been lucky enough to work in some organizations that reward leaders for career development and for developing talent in general. It's been part of what's expected as a leader. I've also worked in organizations where that is the last thing a leader is actually incentivized to do. And so you see a lot of poor behavior around talent hoarding, not sharing talent, building an empire, continuing to re-recruit people you've worked with in other organizations because they can deliver. And that, for me, kind of indicates this need for some really deep mindset work that we can do with leaders. For me personally, I'll share, as a leader, it's always been more important that I'm supporting someone's success in life, not just in the organization we both happen to be working at the time. And that leads to these really awesome and rich conversations about what do they want, not just in their career, not just at work, but what are the experiences they want that might be really satisfying. And every single person in this room has an enormous network of people we can tap into to help anyone on our teams grow into the spaces they want to grow inside and outside the workplace. So I personally think that's always been the thing that moves me away from the fear and into the place of possibility, because I didn't get into this work to just drive success in one organization. I want to leave a legacy of talent building individuals I get to work with, and then they go and do the same thing for the people that they work with.
Here, there are some leadership truths that and commitments that I've made as a leader that have really helped me stay abundant. One, and this comes from one of my grandmothers, she used to drop these gems when she was living, but she always said, you can't keep anybody who doesn't want to be kept. So that's one thing. Two, I believe it's really important to allow everyone to be at choice. Like work and where we are and what we do, it's a choice. All of us being here, making the time and the grace and the space in this week for micro, it was a choice. We need to give people the power and the autonomy and the flexibility to own their choices, and to also understand that sometimes, and in certain seasons of life, especially if there is a significant milestone. When I lost my dad, 2019, I needed to make a different choice, right? And so I would imagine for some of you, maybe you have someone on your team in your organization, maybe they got married, maybe your business exploded over the last 2 years, and they realize they're really tired and they want to do something different. Maybe they've had a tiny human, or they want to have a tiny human, but they don't think they can do that like at your company. I think supporting them and allowing them to own their vision for their career is just as impactful and just as helpful as retaining them and developing them. I think honestly, it's one of the greatest gifts and the legacies we can leave as a leader is to help people exit well. So I don't think attrition is a bad thing. I don't think we should be surprised by the exits on our team. If we're having the conversations we need to have, we're having career check-ins, especially with our directs, then we should know. And then there comes the moment where, as a leader, I've had 2 leaders leave my organization this year, and I remember saying as they were exiting, you know, I'm sad, but I'm also really proud. I'm sad because I don't do well with goodbyes. I do not like them. I never have, but I can help you exit well. But then I'm also really proud because you found an opportunity that I was never going to be able to give you in our current structure. And so we need to, as you said, lead and develop with an open hand.
Just to get philosophical for a second and to piggyback on that too, when we think about that 45-year employee, they're not going to be doing the same thing on the same team for the whole trajectory of their career. And so I think we're probably all in this room optimistic that we're going to start to see all of our systems shift toward, you know, making space for people to have other opportunities, and then likewise for the leadership that supports the system to have and engage in those conversations and be proactive in leading those conversations. How are you going to grow and develop? Where can you go? One other quick point. Has anyone read Radical Candor? I'm a fan too. When she talks about having the dreams conversation with their employees, has anyone ever done that or tried that out? I did it once and it went very badly, and then I learned some things and then it started to turn around for me. But this is a really, as a takeaway for an experiment, as a way to really understand what people want to do, where they could go, what it would look like for them to grow and develop in a non-threatening, oh, you might leave my team sort of way. You start by just asking them, what are your dreams for your life? And then what you can help to do is to create experiences within the context of their work that help them start to satisfy some of the dreaming for their life. And it may or may not have anything whatsoever to do with work.
Yeah, Emily, you just reminded me of something that came back to me yesterday. I forgot who it was in the room that mentioned that we have 5 generations in the world of work. But here's what I know about work today that's been true. Melinda Gates said this in a LinkedIn post several months ago, but she was talking about how we're currently operating in a workforce and workplace that was built for our fathers and not our daughters. It alluded to that, right? So the ways at which, especially stateside, we're choosing to operate aren't necessarily aligned with all of the things that we're able to do today, the same things that we might find with technology. But here's the one thing that I really love about a generation that is not mine, and that is Generation Z. Because Generation Z is the generation that will call you out on your bigotry and then tell you bless you in the same sentence and keep it moving. So I love how that generation shows up because it gives me great hope for how work will be forced to shift, even if we decide we're not aligned with what that might be. I don't think there's a 45-year career person anymore. I think work is going to continue to evolve, which we'll see in retention in real time too.
Great, loved all those answers. Amazing. Let's get a little more tactical now. We've seen a shift to like point of need learning and learning embedded in work for many people facing roles. What does this look like for managers?
Oh, yeah. I think there's a couple of things I've seen work really well recently. And so earlier someone asked the question of, how many of your organizations provide unconscious bias training, and then how many of you actually link that to performance management? And so I can say, in my current organization that's something we do really intentionally. It's like there is specificity around how bias shows up in performance assessment, rating, even in the conversation itself. And so we invest in that moment because we know it's a moment that matters for the employee. Similarly, in another body of work that I worked on a little while back, we anchored manager intervention moments against the talent lifecycle throughout the year. So depending on what's happening in the rhythm of the business at this moment in time, that was the manager moment. And where we started to evolve that was to say, okay, here's the manager moment, here's the team member moment. And how do we make sure these are two parallel paths that are running in tandem with each other so that these conversations that are really important to get right, we have a higher likelihood of being successful when we equip both of those parties to the conversation with the kind of just-in-time, moment of need. Sometimes it's a series of questions. Sometimes it's actually some capability building right before that moment is set to take place.
Yeah, great points. I mean, this is really hard to do well because it requires you to be so in tune and so relevant with what's happening right now, right? And then you have to be able to execute really fast in order to, be able to deliver. So it's really hard. But I'm reminded of a recent Deloitte stat that said that employees have approximately 1% of their work week to dedicate to learning, which is about 5 minutes a day. So don't lose hope. but it really, I think it's a good reality check for us when we think about, learning in the flow of work and point of need. Time is very precious. And the goal is not that we should try to cram everything into those 5 minutes every day, but we should always be advocating for more time, but that we need to, sort of face the reality that we need to meet people where they are. Where they are right now is I need something on the spot when I'm having this moment of need in this moment, which means we have to do a far better job, of anticipating what those needs are, which means that we have to be in lockstep with the business strategy.
For sure. In the spirit of tacticality, one of the things that's been really helpful for us is we created a people manager playbook. So this playbook is the go-to resource for all managers at the company, where they have direct resources, how-to guides, videos that help them understand if it comes to building your team, leading your team, growing your team, developing your team. We've got this playbook that you can go to that gives you that information, or at least get you started in the right direction. So that you know who to go to beyond that. That's been really helpful. I also agree with meeting your people where they are. So one of the biggest leadership lessons and failures that I've had as a leader is I really thought when I got to DoorDash, open enrollment would work. It worked everywhere else that I've been, especially when I was at CCL. And then I got to DoorDash and nobody showed up for all these classes that we opened. And what I realized in that moment was it wasn't what they wanted. What they did want, and once we pivoted in our delivery strategy, was they wanted to learn together in community. And they wanted to know that they had the leadership support to step away, to make the time, because they realized they were an example for their teams if they chose to prioritize learning. And so now we have a wait list quarter over quarter, but it took me being willing to let go of what I thought was right, being willing to meet my customers where they were and where they are, and then staying close to the business strategy that's really made all the difference.
Yeah, we found something very similar at LinkedIn. Open enrollment, we did very well back in the day before the pandemic. Getting people into a room, that was the only way to do it. We had no video conferencing outside of our conference rooms. It was never used for anything learning related. It was just a way to link up buildings or regions. And somehow we got people to show up on campus in a room from all different parts of the company, whether it's Sunnyvale or Dublin. Pandemic struck, and then it's really hard to go back to open enrollment now. First of all, getting anything done in person, that's a huge lift unless you're offering them something extra versus Zoom. But I think the open enrollment model is pretty dead. There's a lot of work that goes into it to get random people together, and there's something wonderful about random people at your company being together. Like, I would never meet an engineer, let's say, except through an L&D workshop. But now I think it's really functionally based. People want to learn with their teams, they want to do in-tech training, and that way you get leadership buy-in from the function, from the team, from the VP, and the learning is, connected, and you kind of have this open, your ears are open, your eyes are open for the learning. So that's what we're driving towards. Great. Do we have time for one more question? Okay. Very tactical. How can microlearning be a tool to help make better managers?
Well, given the fact that we task switch about 27 times an hour, and the average attention span is now down to 8 seconds, which means I've already lost you. I really think that the case for microlearning, it just full stop, is pretty undeniable. But of course, we do have to realize what's fit for purpose in our organizations. And that means deeply understanding the users in the organization, deeply understanding the business strategy, and really being able to understand the content that works well in microlearning. So in my experience, and we're all a fan of one particular kind of microlearning in this room, but in my experience, this really works well as a category with new and emerging leaders, especially when the knowledge is really contained, right? When it's a topic that is probably knowledge-based in nature, something that has a sense of urgency around it often can be really successful. It's really great for quick turnaround, right? And so that speaks back to the needs that we just talked about with our managers previously. They need that sense of urgency and that feeling of on-demand learning.
My hypothesis is that if we segment the different types of managers, so whether or not they're a new manager, whether or not they're more seasoned in their managerial journey, whether or not they're a comp planner or they've got a larger organizational size, my hypothesis is that we could actually increase the adoption of microlearning if we are segmenting the learning in a way that's most helpful to what they might need in that point of their manager journey. So haven't tested it, look forward to testing it, but that's my hypothesis in this moment.
Hypothesis. Yeah, I think about, so I just recently bought a house, and everything I've done in the process of doing minor improvements, not great at this yet, has been microlearning, right? I'm trying to figure out how to put up wainscoting in the bathroom. I watched a YouTube video, and I only watched 1 minute at a time, right? To literally walk myself through it. And I'm kind of fascinated that often in the spaces we get to play in, we're not thinking about the learning experience the same way. We're not breaking it down into a 1-2 minute sort of quick, here's what you need right now, and then they go to the next minute when they need that next minute. So I think that's a really hearty and healthy challenge to play with. I know it's definitely counterintuitive for some of us who have been, in organizations that desire the 2-day workshop. And so I feel like one of the components of this work in this particular moment in time is continuing to put those assumptions on the table and really challenging them and saying well, we know people are time starved. What can we do in 3 minutes or less? And similar to some of the other ideas, it's we haven't really done it successfully yet, but what I get really excited about is there will be success stories that come out of this challenge in ways that we're starting to apply microlearning that we're barely scratching the surface.
I love a good 2-day workshop. That's great. And we all know how to do that really well. And we're all in one right now, and it's wonderful, right? So I don't think those are going away necessarily, but I think that they are going to happen maybe on a more deliberate and different place on the curve, for our managers, depending where they are in their people leadership journey.
Yeah, and I would add to that and say that I think we're as much in the information business as the learning business. And I think a lot of us get stuck on the word learning, like it's got to be heavy, it's got to involve technology and instructional designers and follow a certain path. And yeah, there's a place for it, just like the 2-day workshop. But what we're seeing a lot of people need is information in the moment. And it is learning, right? It's just not, there's just not a breakout room. And I remember I worked with somebody a couple of years ago, and they said, well, if there's not a breakout room during a live virtual workshop, it's not learning, right? Unless you go in and turn to your table mate and have a discussion or do a little role play. Yeah, in a perfect world, we would do that, right? That's engagement, and it's breaking down, barriers in your brain, and stuff is starting to stick. But sometimes you just need information in the moment. Like you're heading into performance reviews, right? We all do those. I think most companies still do them. It is a big, big deal at LinkedIn. We just went through them. I have 9 people on my team. I can't tell you how much work went into that. But you tend to forget about it. You have this amnesia all year long. And then it comes around again, like starting in June, because we do all this in August, September. And it's like, I forgot everything I need to know. How do I run the session? How do I give feedback? How do I take feedback? How do I talk about development with my employee? All those things. And if I had kind of a drip, drip, drip during those couple of months, just to kind of relight those things in my brain. But yeah, I don't want to spend half an hour, 2 days learning about feedback. I just need some nuggets. So it's really information, and I'm excited about that.
One metaphor that I use, what you're speaking to reminds me of, this idea of like the 2-day workshop is the multi-course meal, but the microlearning is the vitamin, right? And that combination of multi-course meals and vitamins gets us through the year, but you actually can't like survive with just one or just the other. Maybe you can survive with just the multi-course meal, but play with me on the metaphor. I think like the microlearning vitamins are very often what people are looking for, and so we're over-serving people. They're asking for the vitamin, and we're like, but here's 8 hours worth of content. They do not need it. So I think that kind of goes back to that healthy challenge in this space we're in.
And also, just to continue the metaphor, like here's the Cheesecake Factory menu of all this other stuff that doesn't really pertain to you, but here it is, we're serving it up, right? So yeah, and I think too that we are in this exciting point in time because of all the adjacencies that we're all experiencing in the digital world and just the world that we live in. So it has created this appetite. See what I did there? For things like micro learning, because people understand now that good and valuable information can be exchanged over text or in ways that even just a few years ago would have seemed really unconventional.
We're done.